o'clock. We are back on track for another day of fun and learning. So this is the organic linkages between CSCs and LCCs session. And I'm Robin O'Malley from the USGS National Climate Change and Wildlife Science Center, and we're the part of USGS that is standing up the CSCs. So we're trying to figure out how they're working with LCCs on the ground. And so I'm going to talk from the sort of high-level conceptual perspective that we started this discussion with, and then bring it down to what's really happening on the ground and try to meet those in the middle. So been a lot of discussion about how these relationships work, and I think this is really a session to explore how that's happening and get some ideas about how to make it happen better, how to fertilize some of those organic linkages. And what I want to do is touch briefly on the formal parts of the relationship. And we've got some formal structures that sort of frame how we work together, but move pretty quickly to the people-to-people relationships, and that's kind of the organic nature of this. And as we've been doing this for plus or minus 2 years and standing up CSCs and watching them evolve in their process, it's pretty clear that the evolution among the LCC community in getting permanent and full-time people and staffed up in each LCC, and the same with our CSCs, getting folks on the ground and getting processes in place, that these linkages are going from the on paper and conceptual to real communications channels between the two parts of the organization. So I think this is happening. I want to thank Karen Murphy and the folks who were in the science planning meeting yesterday. I think that's a really helpful part of this conversation. And I think we're going to move this along down a little more focus on the CSC, LCC point. As I think with most of the sessions here, there's not a particularly concrete endpoint. We're not here to make a decision or come up with a mission statement or anything. We're really here to explore how these things work and see if we can make sure we know what we're doing when we do it. So I have one slide. And this is a slide I've used a lot to try to describe the CSC-LCC relationship and how we do business and how we think about it. And so I usually start up here with the science needs coming out of the LCCs and the management community. That's the starting point for our discussions. And you'll see multiple ones of these, so every one of our climate science centers has N greater than 1 LCCs in it, except for Hawaii. So the conceptual model, and here, that's what I'm talking, this started completely as a conceptual model when there weren't any LCCs, when there weren't any CSCs on the ground, so this is where we've taken this. We think the way we operate is we listen to a number of LCCs and the management partners in the region. To the extent they're all captured in the LCCs, that's great. There are other folks that might come to us independently. And we bring those together at a regional level. And again, that's a process where the LCCs that are identifying the needs are also part of this conversation at a regional level to try to figure out, okay, these are landscape level priorities, and there's different ones for the 3-4 ones here. What are the regional priorities? What are the really high value items that we can add to the situation and pull those together? And we do that in some formal structures that I'll mention in a little bit, a stakeholder advisory committee and a science plan. And then the next part of the loop is that we go, and this is a really simplified diagram. There's lots that's not on here, like LCCs going to other partners for science. But part of this is for those big regional needs and the things that we think we can add value to, we reach out to research teams, and the primary research teams primary places we go for research teams is the universities with whom we have created cooperative agreements and consortia. So that's about 40 universities and pretty substantial science depth across a really wide range of capabilities. And USGS, which has substantial depth and real expertise in certain really important areas. So we try to identify how best to meet those science needs. And then I would say that we have formal processes kind of in place to do this part of the diagram. We don't have as good mechanisms that I'll say force or encourage or facilitate the work of the research teams with the managers. And I think that's a part of this diagram that we really need to make sure we get right, is making sure that when we do this work, it really is connected back to the original needs of the users. So I think that's part of the discussion we're going to need to focus on. So the two formal elements, Stakeholder Advisory Committee and a science plan. Stakeholder Advisory Committee has two different kinds of folks on it. People, I'll say from the management side, so the LCC folks, in this case, bringing their management priorities. And if there are other, on our Stakeholder Advisory Committee, we often have Forest Service representatives or other management community representatives that are probably also represented on the LCCs. So there's management type folks who I view in, again, a conceptual model of bringing their science needs to the table based on conservation priorities and needs. The other side of the table are other science assets. So we'll have NOAA at the table, we'll have Forest Service research stations at the table, other folks who can actually do some of this work, so that the two functions of this, of the Stakeholder Advisory Committee up here in this corner, are to really coalesce the regional priorities from the management side of the house, and then to try to leverage the science assets that we have with our research teams, but frankly, parts of an agenda that's created up here could be taken off by the Forest Service, not with our money or what have you. People are doing things because they are important regional priorities. So there's an important discussion at our level with the science folks that we say, so who can meet these needs? How do we actually use the assets in the region and within our programs to meet these needs? The other formal piece that we create kind of up here is a science plan. And we're getting those in place. I think we have one's in place in 5 of the CSCs that we have. And that plan is a transparent attempt to try to roll up what the priorities are, look 5 or 10 years down the road and say, okay, here's the big things we need to do in order to inform adaptation a little more clearly. And then use that plan to tier down to annual kinds of things. Again, LCCs are represented on the Stakeholder Advisory Committee, and their needs are essentially the primary component of that. And from that strategic plan, similar to what we heard in Karen's group yesterday, we do workshops, stakeholder engagement kind of things to try to figure out, all right, specific projects that come out of those broad priorities. So that's a real simple, well, not simple, but conceptually simple process. So these are the formal pieces that we put in place. And there's some interesting ideas on the table about how to improve the formal part of the process, like having schedules so that everybody knows when the LCCs are going to identify their science priorities in order that they can do their procurement and actually move money, that coordinate with how we're going to set our priorities. So meshing the timetables of our science prioritization will be a really important process of making element of making a process like this work. So what we're going to do today is we have 2 separate sub-presentations, as it were. I'm going to turn to pairs of folks from a CSC and an LCC to talk about their experience in running through this drill over the last few months to a year or so. So the first pair is Gustavo Bisbal, who's the director of the North Central Climate Science Center, and John Mankowski, who is the coordinator for the North Pacific LCC. Then we're going to turn to Jerry McMahon, who's the director of the Southeast Climate Science Center, and Greg Waffen, who's the coordinator for the Gulf Coast Plains and Ozarks, GCP&O. Have that right? Yeah. So in the interest of that I've already gone past my 1 on the time left, I will get out of the way and invite Gustavo and John to come right up. And if we do this right, there'll be enough time at the end to go through some questions and kind of pick this apart a little bit, but let's do it.
Thanks, Robin, and good morning. I'm Gustavo Bisbal. I'm actually the director of the Northwest Climate Science Center, North Central, so I wear multiple hats, so that's all right. In any rate, I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here with you today and open this session on organic linkages. And John and I thought that the best way to demonstrate how well we're working on the region is to tag team a presentation. So we're going to go through it. I go first, and then he follows. And we have other folks as well representing the other LCCs. So what we're going to do today is show you kind of the characteristics of the center and the three LCCs in the Northwest, that is the Great Northern, the North Pacific, and the Great Basin. And what we want to do is really show you the evolution of our track. Where are we coming from, and that is just about yesterday, and where are we going with all of this and how this is happening. So that is, again, the evolutionary track, and I'm not a plant guy, I'm a fish guy, so I say, that we probably hatched already, and we are past the yolk sac stage, and, we're fingerlings as I'm turning into par. But there we go. Just to address those three phases, the past, and, this is all before my time. I started on the job on December 5th of 2011, so relatively new to all of this. But what happened at that time, we were given a piece of raw clay and told, do something with it. There was not a whole lot of instruction or guidance, not much in terms of a cookbook or here's how you do it. So we're still discovering as we go, and that is challenging and fun at the same time. A lot of the work that we had to do, particularly during fiscal year 11, was more than anything a knee-jerk reaction. It was a little bit schizophrenic and kind of try to, fund things that we collectively thought were necessary to do, but without a whole lot of consultation and opportunities to really sit down and scratch our heads and say, what is it that we need to do? And particularly, the last bullet there, a lot of folks were saying, where are you? How are you different? But, the Climate Science Center from the LCCs, who does what, and, trying to sort out the perception of overlap, duplication, and, waste. So, again, part of the challenge was to try to iron out those wrinkles and make sure that there was a clear understanding of our respective responsibilities and what we needed to do. The second phase, which is the present, we can pretty much say that there is, we're gelling out, we're ossifying, we're turning into, we're gaining our own identities, and primarily, we can talk about, for instance, just logistics like staffing. Again, I've been on the job for 114 days as of today, and I know that John and many of the others are relatively new as well in their capacities. So we're trying to begin to work with one another. We're trying to define our processes, invite our stakeholders, understand who needs to participate and in what capacity. What are the meetings that we need to put together, for what reason? What are the questions that we need to ask and answer? And what kind of intervention we seek from regional participants. Again, the policy direction now comes from a lot of these groups that are taking shape as well, and that is part of our present condition. And as the evolution continues and we move into the future phase, we're detecting things that could be improved as early as the next fiscal year. For example, in FY12, we're better than last year. We have RFPs in place. We are soliciting work. We're trying to better target, the kind of information that we need to gather, and how do we coordinate. But next year, in FY13, we're already thinking about how to, streamline those efforts, how to alleviate the sense of confusion that may be out there, try to invite people in a more effective way and engage participants and stakeholders in ways that they understand and they can help us in more meaningful ways. So with that, I will just give you a quick overview of the Northwest Climate Science Center. Again, this is one of 8 created nationally. This one came online in 2010, and prior to me, there were 4 acting directors. So again, everybody was scrambling and trying to make it happen and go through the day. Now the lights are on, the doors are open, and we're ready for business. So that's where we're trying to go. There is a vision statement. Basically, we're trying to become a premier center for the delivery of climate science, and we want to provide or realize that vision through the provision of best practice services. And those best practice services are listed in terms of objectives under 2 overarching goals. The first one of these goals is more administrative, if you will, more management-oriented, and it talks about establishing a leadership presence to try to strengthen the region's ability to plan and implement a climate science portfolio. Of those 2, under executive services, really, we're talking about the leadership component of it, and in the Northwest, the leadership of the Climate Science Center is a shared responsibility. And I'm going to introduce a couple of partner groups, if you will, that we work with. The first one, as Robin mentioned, is we do have already an executive stakeholder advisory committee. That group represents 22 entities, 13 of which are federal agencies, the 3 LCCs in the region, the 3 of the 4 states, and 3 tribal entities that collectively represent about 75 tribes in the Northwest. The ESAC, as we call it, was first assembled in 2011, and we're coming up to another face-to-face meeting. That would be the second in their lifetime. That's happening in Portland, Oregon, May 2nd, I'm sorry. So looking forward to their guidance and their perception of the center, and where do they think that we need to take this operation. Another group that we work very closely with is an academic consortium in the Northwest, and that represents 14 institutions or academic institutions, and there are 3 primary ones: Oregon State University, University of Idaho, and University of Washington, and those are sort of the ones that lead the academic effort of what we do, and they provide the science, the analysis, and the necessary research data and so forth. There is a subset, like sort of a board of directors, if you will. We call it the leadership team, and that represents the regional executive for the Northwest area with the USGS, myself, and the 3 principal investigators for the 3 schools that I just listed. So all of us kind of think about the day-to-day operations. We meet once monthly and so forth. So again, the ESAC and the academic consortium, mainly represented through this leadership team, are sort of the folks that we work the closest with. The second goal there, to go through it quickly, lists 3 objectives, and that has more of a functional flavor. The first one on data services refers to data management. We all have our own little coffee can where we put our numbers. I was talking about that example last night, but the idea is, how do those coffee cans talk to one another? How do we provide the numbers that are necessary out there? How can we optimize the effort, understanding that this has a huge cost and can create a fair amount of confusion? So that is one of the services that we would like to provide in this center, and try to, again, connect those wires. In terms of communication services, we're buying science, we're generating the science. Is it sticking? Are we making a difference? Where and how? And that is something that we really need to think carefully about. How are we resonating with stakeholders and our partners. Is the message coming across? The final one that's important to me as well, is how do we groom the next generation of climate scientists? In doing so, they are usually the ones that do the heavy lifting and the work through these research efforts. And the question is, how do we bring them in early so that they become the next wave of researchers and educators? So that's a quick overview of the Climate Science Center, and now my good friend John is going to take over.
Thanks, Goose. I'm going to sort of pick up right where he left off and give a quick overview of the LCCs and then move into the conversation we've been having about how to integrate LCCs and the Climate Science Center. So I'm sort of channeling the interests and needs of two other LCCs, both the Great Northern and the Great Basin. I see Linda's in the room, and I saw Yvette somewhere around here. So I'm sharing some of the conversations that we had, and of course Gustavo gets to serve all of our needs. So one of the things I want to point out with this slide is that while our LCCs have some things in common, we are different. We're different, we're focusing on slightly different things, and that's a good thing because we're designed to focus on regional issues. These are some select quotes from the missions of the various LCCs. These were called Great Northern, Great Basin, and I feel like the North Pacific is pretty important too. But the point is, in the Great Basin, they're working on a separate set of issues. They're not all climate-centric. Great Basin is working on shrub steppe issues, cheatgrass, grouse issues as well. Great Northern is working on large-scale conservation issues, transboundary issues, invasive species. And the Great Northern is focusing quite a bit on transboundary and climate issues. But we have some things in common. The things we have in common are really our climate-based science needs. They're not all in common, because remember, LCCs were created to do a number of things. They were created to address the lack of science that's accessible in an easy, readily available manner. They were created to address the capacity to organize, to bring people working in conservation together. A little bit different focus than the Climate Science Center. And they were created in part to help create a strategy to coordinate conservation across large landscapes and to help address the fragmented financial resources. So we have a little different set of kind of marching orders or mandates, but we have some things in common, and that is our science climate needs. So here was my attempt. We all have our own charts and graphs to put this together. So I put together a title. We put together some concepts about science development in the Climate Science Center and science applications being a focus of LCCs. We put some words in here, and then we even did a cartoon. So if this doesn't do it for you, I don't know what we're up to. One thing I want to point out here is the governance structures of the LCCs and climate science centers are related but different. So the governance structure is really determined, as you heard from Gustavo, by the ESAC participants, which are primarily federal, state partners, and tribes. The LCCs have a little more engagement, I think, with stakeholders in the way they're designed and structured. They often engage NGOs, conservation partnerships, tribes and First Nations, and international partners as well. So there's a bit of a distinguishing characteristic there, which is a strength, I think, in terms of understanding the needs of our conservation partners over here and being able to deliver to Gustavo a pretty good sense of science priorities throughout the region. The funding is related but slightly different in that the funding is really geared towards universities and USGS. Partnerships are encouraged. Those partners that are involved in research on these issues are encouraged to partner with these university consortium partners or USGS. The funding is a little bit more broad in LCC land, in that we can fund partnerships, bringing people together, we can fund tool development, management-oriented science, and numerous entities are able to receive funding. In the North Pacific LCC, we fund some conservation organizations, we're interested in funding some tribal organizations and others, so we can help build partnerships, advance conservation with a little more latitude as opposed to the Climate Science Center focusing on some of the core fundamental science challenges that are out there. And related to that, the science focus for Climate Science Centers is pretty targeted on the ecological response to climate change. It really encourages a federal academic partnership, and they produce policy-relevant science that's designed to not be prescriptive. The science focus on LCCs, in our experience, has been that it's not necessarily climate-centric. It's often related to climate, but depending on where you are in parts of the country and what your partner's issues are, it doesn't have to be climate-centric. We also target our funding towards science and information needs, tools, partnerships designed to inform management decisions. So there's some similarities, but there are some important differences. And I think those important differences acknowledges the strengths of each entity so that we can put them together smartly and have a stronger organization combined. So one of the ways I think about this is if you're visual, that LCCs are trying to create ways to advance conservation with a lot of different elements. Partnerships, tools, transboundary conversations, international partnerships. But when and where we have science, climate-related science needs, we're coming over here. Because these guys are working on that. So Gustavo and I got together and said, look, sometimes these titles are a little bit nice and flowery, harmonizing the development of application. I could have titled this a little differently, and that is, Gustavo and I needed to sit down and sort of negotiate a prenuptial agreement after an arranged marriage. So Gustavo's my partner. I didn't pick him, he didn't pick me. We have a marriage, and now we're negotiating a prenuptial agreement after. But we took this in stride. We met with each other and had a lot of conversation with other LCCs and others, and we said, let's sit down and figure out ways that we can quit talking about the relationship and just do it. Just quit talking about charts and arrows and graphs, and let's just put it into practice. Where can we or should we coordinate our activities? And these are all different. Where can we and should we integrate our activities? And where should we share leads or recognize strengths of certain individuals? And where is it just fine to work independently? There might be some areas where the LCC wants to go and work on wildlife corridors, in a certain area, and we don't really need to have a conversation with the Climate Science Center. That could happen too. So we put our heads together, talked to staff, and developed a list, and we came up with 12. We came up with 12 areas where our programs intersect. And we put those into different categories. Let me back up one. There were opportunities to coordinate, integrate, and share leads, and each of these slides now are going to be the ideas in those categories. And at the end of this conversation, there's a lot of people in the room that work in this field. We don't want to pretend like we've cornered the market on our best 12. We want to get that number higher based on your input as well. So where areas where we should coordinate with each other? Number one, the cross-pollination built in our organizational structures. And this sounds boring, but I think it's important, and that is the fact that the Climate Science Center or USGS partners are usually on LCC committees, steering committees, or subcommittees. So that forces us to have a conversation and continue to understand each other's priorities and make sure we're efficient in our work. Conversely, the three LCCs communicate with the Northwest Climate Science Center either through review teams. We're currently involved in helping review project proposals that are responsive to Gustavo's RFP, or we participate on the ESAC. So we've built institutional cross-connection and coordination processes there. Another opportunity that we see, we're working on now, and we have a little more work to do in the future, is data management platforms. It's pretty clear that both the North Pacific LCC, the Great Northern, and others are intending to work in this area. A lot of our partners are saying one thing LCCs can do is help us understand what data is out there, how to make it readily available to our customers and share that. Well, the Climate Science Center is too, and they're putting some really intensive resources into some university folks to help create a data and information sharing platform. We don't know the answer to this, but we know we have to have the conversation. And if we can use the same system, we should. If we use different systems, fine, but they should talk to each other. Moving on, our funding decisions. We want to make sure we coordinate on our funding decisions so that we're really contributing different parts to a regional set of priorities. Opportunities to integrate and tier, and this is where we actually would work together on things. Number one is our science strategies. Climate Science Center is developing one. We're developing one. We're using the same timing planning horizon, basically 4-year plans. And we're developing ours. Other LCCs will develop theirs with the Climate Science Centers up on the wall. We need to know where they're going so that we don't duplicate that. We can add value to it, and they need to know where we're going. So we're going to integrate, maybe conceptually at least, our long-term strategic plans and our annual plans. We're also talking about holding joint workshops where the LCCs and Climate Science Centers are at the table, understanding scientific approaches to addressing some of these challenges that we're facing on climate and conservation, so that once we have these joint conferences, we can go back, develop our science plans, and work with our partners in a way that ensures that we're integrated and coordinated. Our stakeholder priorities. The 3 LCCs are working towards a system where we can develop our stakeholder priorities with our broad outreach in time to drive the Climate Science Center's work plans. That seems simple. It's really hard to do, but it's basically kind of pass-fail. We need to do that or else not going to go well. And joint rollouts. When we have products from the LCCs, into the LCCs, and Gustavo has products, we want to do them jointly so that to the public, they understand how these are integrated and linked. Here's a quick example of Northwest Climate Science Center in their June 2011, how their priorities, their projects, were highlighted as being reflective of some of the climate, some of the LCC priorities as well, just to demonstrate that we've done some of this stuff in 2011 and these systems will create more of that. And finally, on the downhill stretch here, opportunities for sharing and trading leads. Stakeholder outreach. I think LCCs may have more opportunities and capacities for NGOs and private sectors and others to engage directly. So we want to do that and take advantage of that and deliver, as I said earlier, to Gustavo, a pretty good, broad, well-vetted sense of regional priorities, some of which relate to climate. Joint Tribal and First Nations Agreement. DOI clearly has requirements to consult with tribes early and often. LCCs do as well. LCCs are spending a lot of time and attention on tribes and First Nations, cultural and natural resources. We don't need to do this separately. Frankly, we drive the tribes and First Nations a little crazy. If Gustavo calls them and says, come to my ESAC committee, and 2 weeks later I call them and say, what are your science priorities? And then someone else calls them. So we're really working hard to get our house in order so that when we do reach out to these other organizations, we have a better sense of what our priorities are and we don't duplicate our processes. Building multinational partners. Here's a place where LCCs are extending into Canada and beyond. We can help provide linkages to the Canadian counterparts dealing with climate science and make some of those connections. And conversely, these climate scientists are working a lot with university researchers and organizations, probably more so than the LCCs, but not necessarily. They can bring to the table some of the capacity and research tools that the universities are developing. So that's a summary. We'll hold questions and ideas until after the next presentation, but we look forward to getting feedback on our 12 ideas, and maybe we can get that number a little higher. Thank you.
So, Jerry, and I just take the analogy of a prenup. There's no divorce in this state. So,
Good morning. I'm Jerry McMahon, the director of the Southeast Climate Science Center in Raleigh, located at NC State. And I think Greg and I probably would say that, at least at a broad level, much of what Goose and John just described maps to what we're doing. So I appreciate you guys taking care of those details so we don't have to do that. Instead, and actually I really liked Bruce Stein's point about Wayne Gretzky yesterday. Instead, I think what we want to do is, or what I want to do here, and Greg will follow up, is first of all talk about some of the challenges for figuring out where that puck is going to be in the future and sort of what's involved in getting to that place where the puck is. But also, once you're there, what might it look like, at least from the CSC side in terms of the type of science that we're doing. And then briefly some initial steps that we're taking to put all this in place. So I think challenge-wise, there's a couple that I want to flag. There are a bunch more that we could talk about, but probably almost 40 years ago, Rattel and Weber planners talked about the notion of wicked problems. And I think it certainly would be fair to say that some of the issues that we're addressing, maybe most of the issues that we're addressing, would fall within this category of what Rattel and Weber called wicked problems. I think a second challenge is that, and it's coming up actually for the most part in a pretty benign way, but we're mixing two different cultures at least in doing this CSC, LCC thing. And that's true both, I think, for folks in the CSC and LCC. We both are trying to figure out how do we come up with a functional and productive relationship among two different cultures, a science-oriented culture and a management-oriented culture, so that the science that we're doing at the LCC or the CSC passes this so what test. And then it's an ongoing dance, and I think these guys described it well, kind of figuring out priorities and differentiating responsibilities. So these are at least some aspects of what stand in the way of us figuring out where that puck is going to be and how we get there. Really complex systems that we're dealing with for all the reasons you guys know all too well. They were described in talks yesterday. But complex systems, but better scientific information doesn't necessarily lead to better decisions. Sorry to hear that as a USGS person. That's what I'm supposed to be doing really well, but it may be that solving the kinds of problems that we're dealing with, these wicked problems, is most likely not going to be just a matter of generating new and better science. Values conflicts and uncertainties abound, in part because we have so many partners that have had a stake in this stuff with different points of views, different cultures, things that they value sometimes really can work at cross purposes, so there's not an easy answer. If you go one way, some people are going to be losers and some people are going to be gainers. And with all that, there's a sense of urgency. We can't wait around until all the uncertainty is resolved, until all the negotiations have taken place, and we've gotten to yes in terms of a great win-win solution. Well, I think in the Southeast we're still not exactly clear about what we need to do to pass the so what test, but I think it is clear that communication is going to be a big piece of that. And up front, again, hard maybe for a USGS scientist to hear, but we shouldn't assume that the scientists know best about the so what of a societal problem. Management information needs to frame the science. And I've said this before talking to the LCCs, if you don't tell us how you want to frame the problem, no worries, we'll take care of it. We have a nice tradition in US doing that at times. The other piece is ongoing communication. And we talked a little bit about this last night, actually, at a meeting that we had with the LCCs when I was burning them out, trying to get a piece of work done, tagged on to them being at the meeting here. How do we, from the CSC side, how do we involve the LCCs? But I think it's as true for the LCCs. How do we involve all these partners without burning them out? That's a real issue, because we tend to have our go-to group that we reach out to often, and they might not keep answering the phone. And so, and the second piece of that is how can we communicate in a way that fosters learning and adaptation? Because again, a lot of cultures, a lot of different points of view, we need to be open to being surprised, I guess, is part of what that's about. Defining priorities and differentiating responsibilities. Let me skip over this and just say that in these three arenas where the LCCs and CSCs live most of the time, actually we all are involved in all three of these arenas, and we better just sort of get over any preconceptions we had going into this thing, any compartments. I think we're all going to be doing work in all three of those. So for us, Paul Fackler, an economist at NC State, is working with the Patuxent guys and Ken Williams, the SDM contingent for SDM stuff, and we're probably going to be supporting some of that work next year. In the on-paper notion of how CSCs and LCCs were going to function that I heard a year and a half ago, maybe that wouldn't have happened, but we're going to be in this arena. I'll talk in a minute about some of the things that we're funding this year, and we've been doing a bunch of work in that effort that started before I came on board and continues. Okay, so we think we've gotten to the place where the puck is going to end up. What might success look like from a science standpoint? And I won't read through all of these, but all of this should look pretty good. And I think in the Southeast, there's probably pretty good agreement among the CSCs and the LCCs about these characteristics, if you will, about doing what we're going to consider good science. So what are we doing to get to that place where the puck is going to show up and produce science that meets those standards? Just a couple things I want to flag during the last minute or so that I have. About a month ago, 50-ish people met in St. Petersburg at the Coastal Marine Geology Center down there, mostly USGS, NC State, and LCC folks. And basically what we were trying to do was, first of all, just get to know each other. Secondly, figure out in-house, within USGS and NC State, what are our science capabilities? And you would think that everyone would know that, but trust me, none of us, even in USGS in the Southeast, really had a complete picture of that. And then finally, talk about that stuff in relationship to LCC needs. And at the end of the day, we also had a meeting of our so-called science implementation team that Goose alluded to, which is basically the group that does the detailed science planning. We figured out, given what we heard about the capabilities, what are the LCC priorities and the CSC priorities for the science that we would fund in FY12. And so we came up with these general topics in terms of the call that went out about 2 weeks later. And these guys, again, much appreciated on my part, very generously worked for 3+ hours last night. We had the statements of interest. We got those in about a week and a half ago. We worked through 24 of those things last night to determine which ones would move forward to where we would ask for a full proposal. So again, there's some synthesis of state of the science stuff, as well as some science work. So I think I'm going to call it quits at that point and turn it over to Greg.
Thank you, Jerry, and good morning. I'm Greg Wathen. I'm the coordinator for the Gulf Coastal Plains and Ozarks LCC, and I don't have any slides, so I'm going to spare you a PowerPoint and just make a couple of comments, really. The Gulf Coast Plains and Ozarks is one of 6 or maybe 7, I kind of lose count, LCCs that have an interest in working with the Southeastern Climate Science Center. So that's one of the challenging things, I think, for Jerry is to figure out how to meet the needs of all those different LCCs. I really had about 3 or 4 comments, and then I'll be done. Just thoughts on this organic relationship, and it very much is organically being built, and that's probably a good way to describe it. But LCCs have a responsibility in this enterprise, and that is to develop a science agenda. And I think some of us are a little bit behind the curve on getting that done. We've done some preliminary work, and we've elevated our needs to the climate science centers from that perspective, but it's probably not as well thought out and developed as it needs to be and will be in the future. And that science agenda is really going to reflect the priorities of our steering committee members and the organizations that work with us. So hopefully that's a big part of this relationship. Structurally, as John and everybody else has talked about, we participated in different ways with the Climate Science Center on the Stakeholder Advisory Council, the Science Implementation Panel. At least in our part of the world, we have been pretty direct and aggressive about being on the Science Implementation Panel and making our needs known and being pretty vocal about that. And I think Jerry would agree with that, and he's been very accommodating to the LCCs and listening to us and trying to meet our needs. Early on in some of the documents that were put together about the relationships between CSCs and LCCs, the terminology that I really liked, and I think it's kind of been dropped out, but I still like it, is LCCs are the primary clients of climate science centers. I think that's maybe gone away a little bit, but I'm still kind of holding on to it as we are the primary clients, and we want to make sure we'll continue to be the primary clients. So we're trying to maintain that as much as we can, realizing that there are a lot of other folks out there that may not necessarily be associated with an LCC that should be working with climate science centers as well. I like Jerry's thinking about where the hockey puck's going to be, and we must be telepathically communicating because we didn't talk about that this morning before we got up here. But I was thinking the exact same thing after yesterday's plenary comments. This really is a unique relationship and a unique opportunity that we're building to kind of figure out where do we want to be in 20 to 40 or 50 years? Where's the puck going to be? Where's climate change going to take us? Where is urban growth going to take us? Things like that. And as we're building our science needs, both LCCs and climate science centers, that's what we need to be striving for, is to look down the road, what's the future going to look like, and where does our management community and our conservation community need to work to meet those needs. And so I really like that. I appreciate you thinking about that as well, Jerry. And I think I'll just end with that. I think we've got a very strong, good working relationship in the Southeast with the Climate Science Center. I'm excited about working with them. I'm very excited about the opportunities to do some great work on that. So.
Well, thank you to everybody here. Let me, those were great presentations. And so Goose mentioned, I think, that we didn't hand our directors a cookbook for how to do this, and that's exactly right. The slide that I showed up was about as far as we got in terms of real process. So what we're seeing from the headquarters level is 8 replicates of how this relationship is going to build. So, and I want to pick up on Greg's comment. If the notion of being primary client has dropped out of the language, it hasn't dropped out of the concept. I hope that's pretty clear. We have about 15 minutes. I want to kind of open it up to additional comments on this kind of relationship, maybe from other LCCs that are in these regions, but then comments or questions about how we go forward. I have some things, but I pretty much want to open it up to reactions to what you've heard, suggestions for other things that might add to this, how we might communicate this learning that's happening in some of these places, but pretty much let's open it up, and if anybody has questions or comments. Gary.
Would you stand?
Sure. Jerry Morishima. I was curious about a couple things. Some of the slides raised some flags and whatnot, and I wanted to ask about, first of all, the relationship between the LCCs and the CSCs. I think that that's an evolving process, and I understand that. One of the things that was noticeable, though, is that in one of the slides that John displayed, it just talked about the relationship of the LCCs and the engagement of tribes and indigenous communities. I did not see anything similar to that in the CSC arena.
Okay.
And I think it's extremely important that the CSCs engage in government-to-government consultation and collaboration with the Native communities.
Yeah.
Particularly when you're dealing with areas like determination of best science or establishing regional priorities for management.
Yep.
The other question, I think, came from one of your slides, Rob, which talked about regional priorities and regional plans for research. One of the very challenging things with climate that we're all going to have to contend with is that the global impacts of things like climate are going to be manifest locally in many different ways. So the question I have is whether regional priorities are going to satisfy the needs of the various stakeholders and interests that you're trying to serve.
Right. Okay, so 2 things. First, on the tribal engagement, we have made a commitment to offer government-to-government consultation with any tribe who wishes to do that. And so we're actually in the process of reaching out through the CSCs that are actually stood up and moving forward. So we've understood that need and commitment. The other piece of it is that we're also have asked each of the directors to ensure tribal participation on the stakeholder advisory committees. And that, again, you have a government-to-government, more formal part of this conversation. You have folks at the stakeholder advisory committee process, and so we're hoping to make sure those engagements are there. So we didn't mention that, but they're fully part of the process. In terms of the regional science, I think we're hoping to provide things at a regional scale that are useful at a more local scale, and that queue up decisions or support further work that is perhaps more finely targeted towards a specific place. And I think the process that we have, where we have national science agendas being developed and sort of high-level work being done, regional work being done that sort of captures needs in a region, and then moving down to the LCCs where it gets pretty specific and more local and more, is an attempt to try to capture, you got to have really finely targeted work at the local level, but you've got to capture the larger scales of things. So we're hoping, I mean, this is an evolving process, we're hoping that that tier provides the right science at the right scales, and we need to be working at those multiple scales. So I think that's built into the system, that we try to target at the right scale in the right place. So Goose?
Yeah, if I may, try to answer some of your questions, particularly with regards to tribal engagement in the Northwest. The ESAC, the Executive Stakeholder Advisory Committee, is co-chaired by tribal member and our Northwest Regional Executive. So we really look forward to your presence. You know, and we have 3 entities that collectively represent about 75 tribes. So the invitation is there. We're going to renew our efforts and try to do it better. We started last year, and this group has not really assembled face-to-face since March of 2011. So, you know, we're trying to do it better. And so we need to believe in baby steps and, try to make a progression in a positive direction. Another thing is that I also believe that while the sort of the elements of consultation need to be reflected and respected, I also look for actual engagement. So in doing so,
The organic
for example, we have a request for proposals on the street, and that just closed up, and we reviewed all of that. And it came to my attention that tribes have not really picked up on it. So a decision that I made just like that was, okay, I need to reach out to, the largest possible distribution list I can get my hands on and let tribal entities know that this opportunity is there. And as I described, the RFP was not really geared to allow tribes to apply directly, but rather through a partnership with USGS or members of the academic consortium. So the response was great. Tribes would say, how do we play, but also how do we plan? So how do we start thinking with you for the next year? So the response to the second part, how do we plan this, come to the next meeting of the ESAC. The response to how do we play this year and the RFP is I just set up points of contact with each one of our regional USGS centers and said, with all their contact information, if you're interested in participating in one thing about submitting a joint proposal, please contact these people. We got 92 proposals, 10% of them involve tribal members. That you may think, well, 10% is not that much, but it's better than 2%. We can do better. So what I'm trying to highlight here is that the effort is there. We're genuine in the way we're putting our hand out. So I hope that we'll see you there.
Karen?
Good morning. I'm Karen Murphy from Western Alaska LCC. As one of the Alaskan LCCs, I'm acutely aware that data differs as you cross Alaska into Canada, if you're from the lower 48 into Mexico. I think this question is probably for you, Mr. Anybody. But can you talk about the cross-CSC communications where LCC boundaries go over your CSC boundaries, that you're communicating, so a downscale model that you're doing will talk to the neighbor or across international borders?
Thank you for the question. In the Northwest, we have, you saw the description of the strategic plan, and one of the main services is data services. How do we centralize a system that provides, policies on data management, access to the data, safety of that data, interpretation, and so forth. And rather than replicate 25 million different systems, how can we streamline that effort and put it sort of in the same bucket or in similar buckets that can very easily communicate with one another? For the Climate Science Center, as part of the cooperative agreement that we have with the academic consortium, one of the lead universities there, the University of Idaho, has the contract or the subcontract on developing that data cyber infrastructure. And the name that they have acquired is Northwest Knowledge Network, NKN. And they have also received a contract from our central office to provide that data platform for all 8 CSEs around the nation. So as we go trying to demonstrate this sort of homogeneous handling and treatment of data, we're also trying to invite LCCs to at least have a look, and decide then whether that platform serves their purposes and how can we integrate, the information that we each have.
But
Chair,
let me,
one other thing related to that is, that's actually an issue that came up for us, starting at our St. Pete meeting.
Yeah.
Continued last night in assessing the one proposal that we got in this area, because for the Appalachian LCC, of course, they extend into the northeast as well as the southeast, and snow information is useful for them in terms of hydrologic models and looking at efflux and flows and everything. So that's happened. Our ability we responded to that need by virtue of having both Gene Brennan part of our discussions, but also having Rachel Muir at the St. Petersburg meeting, so that we explicitly recognize that this is going to take us out of just our southeastern CSC geography. And it kind of became more complicated last night when Allison talked about, well, we have some needs in the south central as well, potentially, for a part of our geography. So the tension is there. We're trying to respond to it. Where we draw the line, we're still trying to figure out.
and I think in the same way as LCCs are trying to figure out how to talk better with their LCC neighbors, we have this challenge to be able to, and part of this is going to be timing. We got our money, we've got a real run to get the planning done for this year and move through. We've got to get a few steps ahead so that, and to make it more complicated, LCC up to CSC, and then, so we've got a complicated set of relationships and a compressed amount of time to build those plans on an annual basis. So we haven't got a structured relationship of how to bring the 8 CSCs together, but we're really aware, and we're asking them to do the informal stuff, at least at this point, until we can get a little bit ahead of that. Adam.
So I noted that, it seems like on the face of things, the CSC, LCC user-provider relationship is nicely simple. It's a nice construct. The LCC structure, governance structure, though, is diverse in nature, as was articulated. So I'm just wondering, what sort of criteria do you use to determine how wide you're casting that net? Because that's actually, the LCC CSC connection is relatively simple, one-to-one, but then if the LCCs actually represent a much broader user group than one LCC.
Yeah. Well, if I see where you're going, there's a couple constraints on our funding that are really important. First of all, everything we do has a climate connection, climate adaptation, future understanding of history and future evolution. That's a pretty big distinction between the mandate for the LCCs, some of which are focusing much more on immediate problems and aren't so climate-centric. The other interesting and complicated constraint is that the money that's available to operate the CSCs is basically money that comes from USGS and comes through the National Climate Change and Wildlife Science Center. So it's got a color of fish, wildlife, and ecosystems. So there are some needs that could come out of the broad user base of the LCCs or any of our management partners that don't fit neatly into that. And some of the cultural resource things that the Park Service brings up. There are some Indian health related things that I have a hard time distinguishing things and saying they don't have an ecosystem connection, but there is a band of things that are sort of outside of our funding stream. And in fact, there are folks who are watching to make sure we don't spread out and start doing things that reduce the amount of focus on fish, wildlife, and ecosystems. So that's a lens that USGS and our funding color brings to the conversation. So in fact, the Park Service has been considering adding staff to some of our CSCs to help beef up the cultural side of things. We're in discussions with the Bureau of Reclamation to expand out into areas that Reclamation has concerns with that may, again, go into those gray areas that aren't so directly fish, wildlife, and ecosystems. So I think as the process evolves and as those agendas get broader, the funding agencies that can respond to them, we're hoping to bring them into the conversation. So I think, there are some limits to what we can do. We haven't really bumped into those limits yet, but they're there, and we keep them in focus. Yeah. Steve.
Steve Galti for us, or this good session. I think as an outsider, this really helps to show how these things us who work at the regional scale, what I'm hearing, I just want to confirm, is that if we have a regional scale question, we should start with the CSCs first. And then from there, they'll help to link us with CSCs.
That's probably right. If it's at a scale that's larger than the LCC scale, and there are obviously some, that's why we're looking at that scale. So it's why we're trying to have open relationships on our stakeholder process so that we hear through the LCCs, which has a more local lens, and then also from other folks more directly from the management partners to sort of listen to both levels of questions. So I think you got it about right. We have time for one more question. Deanna, in the back.
Aloha, good morning. I'm Deanna Spooner, coordinator for the Pacific Islands Climate Change Cooperative, which is the Pacific Islands LCC. And I have a follow-up question, Karen's question about not only data management, but what we're seeing is an incredible investment by the LCCs and the CSEs into modeling future states, and yet we're seeing a decline in our ability to monitor those states as they change. So this is a very big concern for us in the Pacific Islands.
Yeah.
I imagine it's also a big concern across the entire enterprise as budgets are being cut. So how are the LCCs talking about the ability to validate these investments that we've made over time? And what kind of discussions are being elevated through the LCC, the CSC network, to ensure that we're not just tossing our money down the drain?
Yeah. No, that's a good question, and I don't think it's a very evolved conversation. In both of the original plans, there was a very long document that still circulates around that is an informal thing that sort of is the guidance document for CSCs and LCCs. Both of us have monitoring in our charter. We're both supposed to identify those things, help facilitate it, et cetera, et cetera. But frankly, monitoring scares everybody away. It's very expensive. And so I think, at least on Thursday, there's a part of a conversation about this. I've come out of a perspective where the only likelihood for getting significant resources for additional monitoring is if we show that it serves a lot of people. So if the LCCs can be more articulate about what monitoring they need, and we can show that 20 of the 22 LCCs need this, then there's a possibility of raising that up and making it a priority. I don't see the funding that's coming through the Climate Science Center supporting ongoing monitoring. But the notion of building those priorities and trying to work with the partnerships in the region to pull those together. We have the PNAMP, Pacific Northwest Aquatic Monitoring Partnership in this area, in the Northwest, and finding those kinds of partnerships to build on that. Monitoring is a real killer. It's going to be a very hard conversation, but it's fundamental to a lot of folks. So not a good answer. It's in our work plan, but I don't feel like either the LCCs or the CSCs have gone very far in articulating that or figuring out how to deal with it in the absence of significant new resources. So a good one, but not very well developed yet. It's a little bit after 9. We only have a short break. I want to thank the presenters. Thank you for the comments. And this is a really important conversation.